It was the late 1970s. IBM was and had been for decades the largest computer company in the world by far. But IBM realized that there was a personal computer revolution going on and they had to somehow be a part of it. They also realized, though, that they were ill-equipped to compete in that market. They were IBM. They made huge, expensive mainframe computers and sold them to large corporations for millions of dollars. Everything in those computers was made by IBM, and the software that ran them was written by IBM. It would take years for IBM to develop a personal computer using its traditional approach. And moreover, it would not be price competitive with those being sold by the small, nimble companies in the space, like Commodore and Apple. They decided that they needed to address this market in a non-IBM way. So they set up a brand new business unit named Project Chess in Boca Raton, Florida, far away from their upstate New York headquarters. This new division was quite autonomous and thus unshackled by the traditional IBM rules and policies. They came to the conclusion that to compete in the personal computer market, they shouldn't make any part of the computer themselves. They would build their computer using components purchased in the open market, and they would outsource the software that would run it. To that end, on November 6, 1980, IBM sat down with a 25-year-old college dropout that looked 12 and signed a contract with him to have his little-known, tiny company supply the operating system that would run IBM's personal computers. A dozen or so years later, the once mighty IBM was losing billions of dollars a year and struggling to stay afloat. Meanwhile, mostly because of the contract he signed with IBM in 1980, the erstwhile 25-year-old became the wealthiest person in the world in 1995. Wait, what? Of course, the 25-year-old was Bill Gates, and the company that IBM signed the operating system contract with was Microsoft. But it didn't happen quite so simply. IBM had initially contacted Gates because Microsoft was known as a supplier of BASIC, a computer language popular at the time that had to be included with any personal computer. IBM and Microsoft made the deal for BASIC, and then the IBM guys told Gates that they needed an operating system as well. Gates said that Microsoft was not in the operating system business and referred IBM to a company named Digital Research Inc. that had developed an operating system named CP/M, which was used by many personal computer makers at the time. Gates even got Digital Research's founder, Gary Kildall, on the phone and set up an appointment for him to meet with the IBM guys the next day. When the gentleman from IBM arrived for the appointment, Kildall wasn't there. He was out flying his airplane. He had asked his wife and business partner, Dorothy McEwen Kildall, to take care of the visitors from IBM. Before they could even address operating systems, the IBM guys asked Dorothy to sign a non-disclosure agreement. On the advice of the company lawyer, she declined, so there were no further discussions and the IBM guys left disappointed and returned to Microsoft. When they told Gates what had happened with Kildall, Gates became afraid that if IBM didn't get their hands on an operating system, they wouldn't be able to go forward with their new personal computer, and Microsoft would lose the opportunity to sell them BASIC. So Gates told the IBM guys that he, Gates, would get them an operating system. But Gates didn't have an operating system. However, Gates' partner at Microsoft, Paul Allen, knew a programmer named Tim Patterson of the Seattle Computer Products Company that had developed a variation of CP/M called QDOS for a quick and dirty operating system for his own hardware. Microsoft obtained the full rights to QDOS for $75,000, and QDOS, rebranded as PC-DOS, was the operating system that Microsoft supplied to IBM. Okay, so IBM goes to market with its personal computer running Microsoft's operating system. Why did it go so badly for IBM and so well for Microsoft? Well, let me tell you. Initially, the IBM PC was a great success. They were sweet machines. I owned one of them in the early 80s. But in a matter of just a few years, IBM lost control of the market it helped create, fundamentally for two reasons. Reason one was their decision to make the IBM PC with off-the-shelf parts available to anyone. But this would not have been a problem were it not for reason two, which was a clause in IBM's contract with Microsoft that allowed Microsoft to license the same operating system that powered the IBM PC to other computer manufacturers. In what is considered one of the biggest business blunders of all time, IBM did not get exclusivity for PC-DOS. Some say IBM's lawyers simply misread the contract. Others say the lawyers intentionally agreed to a non-exclusive agreement due to IBM's lingering antitrust concerns. Regardless, though, other computer makers were able to buy the same parts and make machines equivalent to the IBM PC and then license the same operating system directly from Microsoft so their computers would run the same software that the IBM PC did. The only stumbling block was the BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System, a small but critical component of the computer, and the only part of the IBM PC that was actually developed and owned by IBM. But some computer manufacturers like Compaq were able to reverse engineer the BIOS, and other companies such as Phoenix Software Associates also reverse engineered it and licensed their version to anybody who wanted it. So the stumbling block was quickly dispatched. Basically, any computer manufacturer was able to make so-called IBM-compatible computers, also known as clones, which would function identically to the IBM PC. But those companies like Compaq and Dell had way less overhead than IBM, so they were able to sell their clones for far less than the IBM PC's price tag. In just a few years, IBM became an insignificant player in the personal computer market and ended up selling its personal computer business to Chinese company Lenovo in 2004. So, let's pour one out for the IBM PC. For a brief moment in time, it was the best personal computer you could buy. It was also the first to boast a CPU made by Intel and an operating system made by Microsoft. So unless you use a Mac or a Chromebook, your personal computer is a direct descendant of the IBM PC. I'm Jack Azout. Thank you for watching.